if you're a politician and you commit a crime, or a grand jury believes, based on a preponderance of the evidence, that you have committed a crime and you should face trial for it, you should face trial for it. That's the way the system works. And just look at New York politicians. Donald Trump is a New York politician, right? That's where he came up. He's since moved to Florida. More on that in a moment. But as a New York politician, as somebody came up in the New York political and business milieu, he knows as well as anyone that New York politicians in particular get indicted all the time. In just the past few years in New York alone, we've had not one, not two, but 3 different New York congressmen indicted, and the lieutenant governor, and 6 state senators, including the leader of the Senate, and at least 7 state members of the state assembly. Before I got bored and stopped counting at 7, there might be more. There is very little practical impact in regular human life of an American politician facing an indictment, especially when the charges are such that the trial itself is likely to be slightly less interesting than watching paint dry on something where you don't really care if the paint dries. Politicians get indicted. Current office holders get indicted. Former office holders get indicted. Current candidates for office get indicted. It happens all the time. It's not even like we don't have recent experience of a bold-faced name Republican candidate running for president while under criminal indictment. That just happened. Rick Perry did it in 2016. He conducted his entire Republican presidential campaign while under criminal indictment, which nobody remembers because, honestly, the thing that messed up his chances at the White House is when he said oops at a debate when he couldn't remember which government agencies he wanted to eliminate. It wasn't the indictment. That made no impact on his political prospects. Indicting politicians and former politicians and candidates for office is an American pastime by public corruption prosecutors at state and federal level. It's a thing that happens all the time in this country, so much so that it is often boring when it happens. It's a one-day story or two-day story or a week-long story, and then by the time there's a verdict that comes back around in the news again, and then it does not break our system for members of the political class to face legal accountability for alleged crimes. It's, in fact, a cherished part of our system that shows you our system is working, which shows you that political power does not exclude you from the obligation to comply with the law. In our system, there is one weird quirk. Only serving presidents are immune from federal prosecution, and that's only federal prosecution, and that immunity only lasts while that one person still holds that one office. But other than that weird thing, which is kind of a weird idea, and maybe will go away someday, other than that tiny little slice of immunity for one person while they hold one job and only while they're in that job, other than that, indicting politicians is totally normal. We do it all the time, and we can handle it. Unless a particular politician seeks to make his indictment a catalyst for his supporters and his party rising up and declaring that the legal system is now over, that the legal system should not apply to him, and therefore it no longer applies at all. That would be something different. That is not an inevitable consequence of a politician being indicted. That is what this former politician and candidate for office is trying to do for the first time. That's the hard part. That's the part that could break us as a country. The indictment, it's Thursday. The indictment is not the thing that is going to change our lives. So we're going to talk tonight about the practical impact of the news today that a New York grand jury has issued an indictment for former President Donald Trump. His lawyers have now confirmed the indictment. The DA's office has now confirmed the indictment and stated officially that it is still under seal. There is word from one of Trump's lawyers that President Trump is expected to be arraigned. That means he's expected to be, that we expect him to turn himself in to be booked on these charges on Tuesday next week. But who knows? Because that gets us to the one actually completely off the rails thing that has happened today. The one break the rules, break the system thing that has happened today since this indictment was first reported by the New York Times. And it relates to the fuzziness of that specific part of the plan. the way it logistically works for a person to be indicted on felony charges, specifically the question of Trump turning himself in to face arraignment. There is one thing that has happened today, not the indictment itself. The thing that has happened today that does potentially pose a threat to us as a country is something that somebody completely outside this story, completely outside this criminal process, completely outside this news, decided to do in response to it. And that is something that happened within 5 minutes of Trump's lawyer first putting out the first statement to reporters that Trump would turn himself in for arraignment early next week. We got one Trump lawyer telling reporters early next week, Trump will turn himself in. Within 5 minutes of that first statement from Trump's lawyer, a Republican politician named Ron DeSantis, who is the governor of Florida, made this statement online, saying Florida will not assist in an extradition request, given the questionable circumstances at issue with this Soros-backed Manhattan prosecutor and his political agenda. And that's some of the verbiage in this statement from Ron DeSantis that echoes word for word what Donald Trump said in response to his own indictment today. He's echoing Trump's language exactly, which is fine. Criticizing the legal process, criticizing the indictment, criticizing your perceived political enemies, calling for your supporters to blah, blah, blah. Okay, got it. Saying that the legal process for extraditing somebody from one state to another is something that will not be followed. The Florida governor, if Trump decides that he's not going to turn himself in, that he's going to stay in Florida and come and get me, Florida's not going to allow that process to go forward because it's a former president, because it's Donald Trump. Well, that could break us. I mean, indicting a president, indicting a politician is a normal thing in this country. Trying to say the legal system no longer applies in this country if you try to apply it to our political guy, that is something that can break the rule of law in this country. That is something, I mean, if anything is the first proverbial shot at Fort Sumter today, that shot was fired not by Donald Trump, but by Ron DeSantis. Now, in terms of next steps, here's what we think we can expect. Now that Mr. Trump has been indicted, that basically leaves two potential paths. He could turn himself in and voluntarily surrender to the Manhattan DA's office. He could refuse to surrender and force authorities to go get him, which would mean, handcuffing him and arresting him and taking him into custody against his will. I mean, Donald Trump, according to his lawyers, plans to take option number one. He has two lawyers assigned to represent him in this case, Joe Tacopina and Susan Nicholas. One of his lawyers told NBC News tonight that Trump is expected to be arraigned on Tuesday. The first statement was they expect him to turn himself in to be arraigned early next week. The second statement had more specificity. It said on Tuesday. That guidance, again, from his lawyers indicates that Trump intends to self-surrender, that he will turn himself into authorities on Tuesday. The Manhattan DA's office says they have already been in touch with Trump's legal team about coordinating the surrender. But tonight, the former president is currently in Florida, where he now lives. If he does decide to turn himself in on Tuesday, he'll have to travel to New York City. He'll have to report to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. There, he will be formally arrested. Like all criminal defendants, he will be fingerprinted. He will have his mugshot taken. He will be read his Miranda rights. All of this will happen under the supervision of his Secret Service detail, which protects him everywhere he goes. The Secret Service is required by law to protect not just current presidents, but also former presidents at all times. And presumably that means even while they're being arrested and arraigned and fingerprinted and having their mugshots taken. Now, up until that point in the process, all of that would happen behind closed doors. The next part we might actually see after he's booked and processed, Mr. Trump would be transported to the courtroom adjacent to the DA's office. Typically, defendants are brought in through the court's public entrance, though it's possible authorities could figure out some way to give him private entrance into the court. It's also typical for defendants brought up on felony charges to be handcuffed upon their arrival to this court. It's possible an exception will be made here for the former president, but we don't know. Finally, Donald Trump will be brought before a judge for his formal arraignment. The judge will ask him to enter his plea in open court of whether he's guilty or not guilty. Trump's lawyers have already said tonight that he intends to vigorously fight the charges, so one could interpret that to mean he intends to plead not guilty. After that, Trump will be given a date for when he's next required to appear in court, and then presumably he will be free to go. Given the nature of the charges that we're expecting here, we're guessing that he'll be required to post bail. I say the charges we're expecting because we haven't actually seen the charges yet. Normal procedure would be for the indictment and formal charging documents to be unsealed on the day of the arraignment. However, NBC's Jonathan Dietz reports tonight that conversations are currently underway about unsealing the indictment before Trump is actually arraigned. Dietz reports that a judge is currently weighing the decision of whether or not the indictment should be unsealed early, again, ahead of what's expected to be a Tuesday arraignment. At the very least, though, if he does turn himself in, we expect to see the indictment at the latest by Tuesday when he is expected to be arraigned. That, of course, implies that he's not going to stay in Florida and try to set up some sort of not political but physical conflict in which Ron DeSantis tries to prevent law enforcement from being allowed to get him and arrest him while he refuses to turn himself in. NBC News is reporting that Trump is expected to appear before a judge after 2:15 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon. The fuzziness around that question, the proclamation of refusal to abide by the legal process by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis tonight casts a shadow over that. That does make this what ought to be a boring thing, makes this now a moment that is hard to predict.